Okay. Right, they should be here.
Definitely a few more than 10.
Yeah, definitely. Hi, everyone. If you're just joining, just have a look at the intro slide. If you can see it in the chat, please just write your name, your school, your context, your thoughts on the pre-release, anything like that, and what you've done so far with your 11. So we're just going to wait a couple minutes just to see who else turns up. Just bear in mind, if you could, I think it's already going to force your mics off and your cameras off, but if you haven't done so, please do that. Just want to save on the bandwidth, essentially, because I'm expecting quite a few people here today. But welcome, everybody, if you've just arrived. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks for starting us off. Alecia, Katie, and Glynnis, if you at any point, if you could just keep your eye on the participants list. I don't know if you can see it as well, and if you spot Amanda in there, just let me know. Give me a shout if you can.
Will do.
Thank you. All right, thank you to everyone for introducing themselves. We'll give it about, I think, maybe about 2 more minutes or so, just to let everyone in who wants to be here. And yeah, do write as well in the chat what you've been doing with your Year 11 so far in the limited time we've had the pre-release for just 2 weeks, I think, or coming up to 2 weeks. So this is going to be very well attended. We're 6 away from hitting the century. We're at 94 at the moment. Okay, right. We'll give it 1 minute for starting. I don't want to hold you up too long on your Thursday evening. Okay, lots of you clearly have started looking at the pre-release. Hopefully today is going to be helpful in sort of guiding you or giving you ideas of what to do, but clearly a lot of us have already started. Right, I think we will make a start. We are Amanda less, but we'll make a start anyway. Right, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. I know this is probably one of the last things you want to be doing on the penultimate day of term, or some of you may have already broken up and some of you may have a whole more week to go, so good luck to you if you do. This is the AQA GCSE Geography pre-release TeachMeet. And basically we want to go through to say how we go about sort of proceeding now we've received the pre-release. I'm Abdurrahman Pérez. I'm joined today by Glynnis, Alecia, and Katie, and hopefully Amanda in a second. And I guess just to start things off, just bear in mind what you can see on the bottom left of the screen just now. We're not allowed to, we're set very sort of strict rules by AQA in terms of what we can share and what we can't share from the pre-release. So today, you will notice all the presenters will only share page numbers or figure names. So do have the pre-release next to you, either the PDF or the paper version, whatever you have next to you. And please do not put any of those images or anything to do with the pre-release in the chat, because I'm hoping to be able to put this on YouTube. So I'm hoping that doesn't get sort of a copyright strike. So in terms of where this came from, a couple of weeks ago, I put out a tweet and a post on the Facebook page for GCSE geography teachers, and it got a lot of traction. About 800 people or so gave me their emails to sign up to this. We're not at 800 people. We do have an Amanda. Thank you, Amanda. 1 second, I'll make you presenter in a sec. We don't have 800 people. We've got just over 100 or so, but I'm sure more will watch it on the replay on YouTube, and it's good to have you all here. Just bear with me 1 second while I make Amanda presenter. There you go, Amanda. You should be able to turn on your camera, but just mute up for now. Okay, so in terms of by way of sort of introducing this is a large event. This is the reason why at the moment you can only see a couple of us with camera access, because otherwise it would just be a bit too much bandwidth. I'm at home at the moment and linked up by Ethernet, but even then I think my internet connection would collapse if all of you had your cameras on. So you'll only get chat access, but I can see you're all using it anyway. So thank you for that. Just a reminder, as I'm sure this goes for all the time, but I guess just in the chat, just a reminder to just be as polite and courteous as you can be. We're all in the dark here. None of us know what's right. I don't know what's right. I'm the one organizing this. Amanda doesn't know what's right. Neither does Alecia, neither does Glynnis or Katie. We're just bringing you ideas. So if someone shares an idea, just make sure, as we would always be as polite and courteous as you can be. I'm also, again, reminding you to please not share any images about the pre-release in the chat, just to avoid any copyright infringements. I want this to be able to go up onto YouTube with no issues. And then finally, this is going to be recorded. So I've started the recording already, and I'll upload it to YouTube, hopefully, probably by tonight when I get the recording. And so anyone who's at a meeting, is on a trip or whatever, should be able to watch back later. So let me just introduce what we're going to look at today. So it will start off with me. I'm the most useless and boring one out of all of them, so don't worry. I've only got some initial thoughts. I have actually started with my Year 11s. I've had 2 weeks with it. We started it as soon as we got it. So I'll just give you my initial thoughts on the pre-release. Then Amanda, who's a Paper 3 assistant lead examiner and quite experienced in Paper 3, therefore will give you an insight into the potential pitfalls that students sometimes fall into. Then we'll have Glynnis, who will talk to you about how to help your students break down tables of data, graphs, and maps. And we know there are quite a few in this pre-release. Then we'll have Katie. Katie's going to talk to you about the structure of the pre-release booklet, especially for those of you perhaps who've not taught it many times, and how to effectively use headings and figures to answer questions. Just actually a couple of days ago, I was speaking to my students about the headings and how important the headings and the subtitles are in terms of when you see how they translate into questions. So that should be really good. And finally, we'll have Alecia, who will talk us through some activities to support students in developing evaluation skills for the final decision section. And then at the end, I'm kind of hoping we'll have a large chunk of time for everyone to sort of put their questions there. We'll do our best to answer them, but obviously we'll have people in the chat as well who can answer them as well. So without further ado, let's make a start. We'll start with me. Here are my initial thoughts. So first of all, I did a bit of an analysis on the pre-release. I just turned the PDF quite simply into a Word document. It's just over 2,200 words as a whole, the document, so quite a bit. On the Flesch-Kincaid grade level, it comes out at a 10.5. That's essentially a measure of how difficult or easy a text is to read. That puts it at about Year 11/Year 12, obviously, because US grade levels don't exactly match up with ours. But that just tells you something. You might think, oh, Year 11, that's okay. I do teach Year 11s, but we know a lot of our students don't have reading ages of a Year 11. And therefore, this is going to be quite tough for them. And even though they have 12 weeks with it, quite a few of those weeks are swallowed up by Easter, and they might be currently being swallowed up by mocks or whatever it might be. So really, close attention to the wording and the words of this pre-release is going to be really important. And again, on the flesh reading ease, it's at a 45.2, which puts it easily at college level in the US. So at least 17 years old. So quite a difficult text, although might not seem like it paragraph by paragraph. I then looked at what the most frequent words were. I don't know how useful this will be. As you can see there, it's waste 88 times, recycling 20 times, incineration 19 times, landfill 17, and energy 16 times. So I guess it's just a matter of making sure students are really, really aware what all those terms mean. But actually sustainable or sustainability only appears 4 times. And I have a sort of sneaky suspicion that it might prove to be quite important, although it only appears 4 times. So, just because a word appears lots of times does not necessarily determine its importance. But in terms of sort of figure by figure, so it might be helpful now to have your pre-release open so you can see it. In terms of figure 1, page 2, there's a map of local authority recycling rates. I've seen a question similar to this before. I believe it was the Amazon and the sort of Peru road building one a couple of years ago. That asked you to compare different areas of non-Amazon rainforest and Amazon rainforest. And I can just see quite easily that becoming a comparison sort of 3 marker. Then there might be something I think probably related to explaining why recycling rates have slowed. There's a bit on the yellow box, but that's, I guess, just my idea on what could potentially come up. In figure 3, that's on page 3, so next one along. Could they perhaps have a pie chart for the expo destinations? Could they have a partially done one, and then our students have to do the rest? Potentially, they have done it before in fieldwork, so that could pop up again. In terms of figure 2 on page 4, I guess this is sort of the AMI side of the argument, along with page 6. So this is the sort of bit where if your students are struggling to sort of play devil's advocate and see their side of it, this is where they need to focus on and sort of see it from their side. And they do have some arguments, although we might vehemently disagree with them. They do have some arguments sort of for the incinerator. Then we sort of finish up figure 2. They've put an entire page there. I'm sure all of us sort of either, let out a huge sigh of relief if we know our students are really good with this, or got really worried. There's a whole OS map there. They are certainly going to do. This is one of the ones where I can sort of bet good money on that 4 or 6 figure grid references could come up. Use of scale, that's sort of the dreaded photographer question as well. Which direction are they facing? But there's potential for that. And so if there's potential for it at least, then it bears sort of thinking about. Then moving on to figure 3, the speech bubbles make for a really, really easy for, against, social, economic, environmental sort of activity. I've already done that with my students. They found that useful. Then again, here's the chance, I guess, to play devil's advocate, right? We're seeing it from AMI's point of view. Could there be a potential there for maybe a class debate for students, and then you have some who are forced, even if they don't want to side with them and actually make an argument for this incinerator, even though it's already been cancelled. And I guess my sort of last piece of advice, and I sort of mentioned this to students as soon as I saw the word sustainable mentioned once, because I know they have this obsession with just assuming that sustainability equals environmental and environmental equals sustainability, and completely sort of ignoring the social and economic sort of aspects of sustainability. And this brought my attention to these sort of 2 things here. I don't know whether you're able to, I think you might be able to on your screen right now, click on these hyperlinks, these blue things. I don't know if you can't, I'll be happy to share them later at the end. But these are 2 quotes that I've taken from a report. The report was commissioned actually by the Secretary of State following AMI's appeal of the decision, and the report writer eventually agreed that the appeal should be turned down, and the Secretary of State also agreed with him, and you know where it goes from there. It was obviously ultimately rejected. But I think on the right hand side you can see 2 clear views. One of a local resident who clearly is, not happy with this incinerator plan. But then you see some thoughts from the Cambridgeshire Chambers of Commerce, which obviously will need to be broken down with students. They won't know what that is, but essentially, as you all know, it's a organisation that's there to support essentially local businesses, and they are very much for the incinerator. And thank you. Someone's just said in the chat the link does work. So good, you'll be able to go to that. It's a very lengthy document, but there are a good couple of sort of sections on it where you'd be able to. So those are my initial thoughts. Hopefully they've been useful. I'll now sort of give it over to Amanda. Amanda, take it away.
You can hear me. Yeah, basically, I have been involved with this paper since its inception. I think what we need to, just thinking about it from with an examiner's hat on, bearing in mind that the number of marks available and bearing in mind the amount of time, it's been reduced to an hour, this paper. So we need to be aware that these students need to complete this issue evaluation in 45 minutes. Now, in my experience, I have found that sometimes your stronger candidates quite often will spend too long on the issue evaluation part of the paper because they've been prepared really well, particularly for the 9-mark questions, and that they're going way beyond the lines available to them in that final decision-making question. So my advice to you really would be to maybe, again, playing devil's advocate and putting together a couple of different questions, because of course it may not be do you agree with the decision that's been made, that it obviously it's not going ahead. You know, there could be a couple of different questions, but I think you need to practice your final decision making question, giving them a sheet of A4 paper and telling them not to go beyond that sheet of A4 paper, because your stronger candidates, if they then go on to additional sheets, which of course are seen and they are marked, quite often they get most of their marks in probably the first 2/3 of the side of A4. And you need to get them into the habit of having a good structure to that answer, so they've got a little introductory sentence, maybe saying what their decision is, and then the key points that they want to make. And then, of course, you want to make sure that they also include a very small conclusion at the end, because we look at the structure of answers as well as the content of what the students are writing. And I feel quite often, if these students have been really well prepared, they can go way over the paper that's provided. They can get the full 9 marks in the space that's available to them, and many candidates will do that. So my advice to you will be to practice this under exam conditions, if you like, and getting them to create extended answers in at the maximum 12 minutes, I would say, but I would get them to try and stick to this 10-minute idea, because I think it's key. Because in our experience, when we came to mark the whole of paper 3, we would find that quite often these candidates that have spent too long on their issue evaluation then didn't have enough time to finish off the fieldwork questions. And some of your stronger candidates were losing simple marks later on in the paper because obviously they were rushing. So I think it's absolutely important. And that brings me on to my second point. Again, this is often the case with your stronger candidates. Those as an examiner, you mark the entire script. You're not just marking it question by question as we used to in the old days. So you see a candidate's entire script. And you would often find that the stronger candidates, and you can tell they're stronger because of the way they write and their language skills, would probably spend too much time on the longer questions, the 9 marks and the 6-mark questions. And then they were not taking care with some of the basic calculation questions that they should have really walked all over. So I think that's really something that you need to drill into them. They need to really be careful that they don't miss questions out. I don't know if you can recall, we had a question where they had to complete a choropleth map. I think it was the very first one, the very first issue evaluation. And quite a lot of them missed that question, and that was in the second section of the paper because they spent too long on the first section. In the examiner's reports from both 18 and 19, understanding specific terminology. Now, I think this relates more clearly to the map extract that you've got. And again, I think this idea of relief is going to come into it somewhere because it's such a flat landscape that I think you need to encourage them when they're looking at the map to really think about the relief of the area. And certainly if there is a map work question and they're asked to identify relief, they need to be thinking in terms of using spot heights, and there are a number of spot heights if you look carefully on the map for specific grid references. So maybe in your preparation, look at some of those grid references and the spot heights and identify the contour lines, and maybe try and think in terms of what the actual relief is, because it was pointed out that 56% in 2018 didn't understand the term relief, and I wouldn't be surprised if they revisit that just to check that schools have taken note of what the examiner report said. Yeah, missing out questions, I've already touched on that a little bit, but this completing graphs, completing maps, quite often those 1-2 tariff questions get missed out because they simply are not taking care. So that's absolutely vital. And again, this is sort of related. We see a lot of people that don't take the care, the precision when they're completing graphs, plotting points, measuring distances on a map, really get them into the habit of using a ruler and also practice measuring distances, converting them to scale, both with a ruler and maybe with a piece of string, because obviously they can have access to a piece of string in the exam. Nothing to stop them having a piece of string in their pencil, in their bag. Their pencil case, whatever the clear bag that they take into the exam, because they can use that. But getting them to get into the habit of actually taking more care when they are completing these graphs. Quite often people throw easy marks away by just not completing them carefully enough and using a ruler to draw straight lines. For example, don't encourage them not to draw straight lines with freehand, because it just doesn't really work. Again, this is now using your booklet. In terms of the meatier answers, the 6 and 9 mark answers, level 1, level 2, level 3, level 1 being a simple response. Quite often a level 1 response, candidates will just lift material from the booklet in their answers and they won't do anything with it. And you really want to try and encourage them not to do that. Yes, they do need to know where all the material is, but to try and put things in their own words. And maybe practice getting them to change phrases from the text in the booklet into their own words. I don't know, Abdi's done quite a lot of work, haven't you, with that sort of kernel sentences and getting them to develop their language. So I think that's quite important. And again, try and develop some tasks where they can select material from different pages of the booklet, because remember, one of the things that is marked is the synoptic context of this. And quite often the best answers, particularly level 3 answers in a 9 or in a 6 mark question rather, would be where the candidates have selected material from different pages of the pre-release, not just from one figure, because that will show elements of synopticity. And I think you need to perhaps come up with some tasks where you are getting them to take information from more than one figure to answer that question, so they get into the habit of doing that. That really, in a nutshell, is just some things that came to mind from my experience of marking these papers. Yeah, I did put a few slides together. I noticed that people were saying that it's not key in terms of the topic. It is very much central to the urban issues and challenges part, but it comes up with features of sustainable urban living. And I think Abdi's point about not seeing the word sustainable, I think it is a feature of sustainable urban living. So and again, that word sustainability is something that was featured on one of the exam reports, I think from 2018 again. So I would absolutely determine that your candidates are happy with that. Now, the next slide, this is something that when we were really advising teachers how to prepare candidates, and this was one of the SAMS paper before we even had the first exam. And this was Dr. Keith Jogdock, who some of you will know very well, I'm sure. His idea was, this is taken from SAMS 2, I think. He said, really, one of the things you want to try and do is to set the scene for your candidates. I don't know if you've already done so. You may well have handed out this document, but I know that children that I'm familiar with at the moment, that I'm helping a little bit with tutoring, they haven't been given the document yet by the school. Presumably that's going to happen after Easter. But I would say set the scene for them. You'll be able to, this is slide which you'll be able to access these hyperlinks. These were just some hyperlinks to short YouTube videos, I think they were, just to give a bit of an introduction to the area, because of course not everybody's going to be familiar with Cambridge area, particularly kids that are living up north or even overseas candidates. So perhaps provide some sort of context to the geography of the area if you're introducing this to your students, so that they can be a little bit more familiar, give them this sense of place. Yeah, again, your points again, Abdi, you brought out all the skills, or you've already mentioned the skills, and I think there's going to be questions get used to 4 and 6 figure grid references to identify particular features, measurement of area, describing the relief. Again, I agree with this idea of measuring and converting to scale distances, not just straight line distances as the crow flies, but also by road as well. And the other thing I thought might be interesting was to think about the area in relation to the height of the proposed incinerator, which I think was something, I think it was 80 meters, thinking about reading it off the top of my head. I think there's one more slide, perhaps, because I know this is something that we suggested again when we were introducing this new paper to schools before the first ever exam. And again, this is one of Keith's ideas. By using photographs in the booklet that have been provided, perhaps reproducing them and getting them in the middle of a big sheet, so that they can use, you could give them the bullet points to put around the map, because again, this is a skill that we've had in exams before where they have to annotate something. So maybe you identify some key features on your whiteboard and get your students to identify these points. And I think personally, things like the height of the incinerator in relation to the relief, because that will give you an indication of maybe the visual intrusion of that in relation to the surrounding settlements, and then maybe set couple of little exam questions that could be answered from, or potential exam questions that could be answered from these photographs that have been annotated with notes. I think that was about everything I'd put together. Was it, Abdi? Was that about?
Yeah, I think it was. Thank you so much. That was amazing, Amanda. Yeah,
Okay.
No, really, really good. Glad to.
Okay, so I'm going to mute myself. Is that okay?
That's fine. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, right. Well, that was Amanda. Up next, we have Glynnis.
Cool, thanks, Abdi. I'm going to sort of spend 5 minutes or so talking to everyone today about a kind of skill we've been using in my geography classes and department that we're calling 6 Things That You Notice. And it's a way of getting students to break down provided maps, graphs, tables of data, and get them to really start looking at what it shows us. So it might be getting them to look at trends or patterns, data manipulation. And one thing that we've also starting to do is get them to prompt for analysis as well. So perhaps getting them to suggest something. So with our sort of pre-release booklet, the main sort of areas I'm going to be focusing on are across pages 2 and 3, where we've got figure 1. So Abdi, if you can pop up my first bit, thank you. So if we start having a look at figure 1, we've got at the top of the page, the growing waste challenge in the UK. So we've been presented with a small pie chart. This might be one of our starting points to get the students to start to calculate the percentage of waste being produced by the different sections mentioned on the key. So we've got the construction, demolition, commercial, household, and other. So this is just getting them to break down the data and identify what's there. So you'll see on my example that just the short little prompts at the 6 things, 1 to 4, are just calculating the waste produced by different sections on the pie chart. Question 5 and 6 are kind of getting them to start noticing other things about the data. So it might be how many times more waste is one section producing than another, because this could link perhaps with a small, multiple choice data type question that students could be asked. And prompt 6 is getting them to actually read the information that's provided with it as well. So what do they notice makes up parts of household waste? So they've actually got to read the information to pull that out. The second one there for the food waste in the UK, I only picked out 3 things for this one because obviously it's a much shorter little section. It's just a short bar graph having a look at the food waste in the UK. But again, getting students to think about, well, what's the trend shown overall on the graph? And then having a look at the start and end point of the figures so that they're able to have values and begin to work out perhaps how much of an increase in food waste we've seen over the time shown on the graph. So you could use something like this to get students, as sort of the activity is called, to what they notice about the data in front of them. Thanks, Abdi. If I can have the next one. So next sort of bit on page 2, we've got the much larger sort of map having a look at waste disposal in the UK. So this is our Cotterell map looking at all the different colours of how much recycling is taking place. So this is slightly more complex. Again, this might be the kind of map that some students could look at and think, what am I supposed to do with that? How do I even begin to break down the data shown? So initially, I'm starting them off quite simply. You can see just getting them to calculate the difference between the highest and lowest recycling rates identified on the figure. Then getting them to start focusing on a specific area. So I've picked out London, looking at the general recycling rate. So students should be able to look at the key, interpret the colours and see what the general recycling rates of London are. We then could get them to have a look at sort of the overall range of recycling rates, because in the top sort of right-hand corner of the map, we've got the graph showing the overall rates. So there's a lot on this that we want to try and break down to help our students understand. Then sort of beginning to look at spatial patterns. So prompt number 4 is talking about, is there a difference between the north and south of England in the difference recycling rate? So is there a contrast between the two locations? Then looking at the lowest areas, and so London obviously has quite a large amounts of areas with recycling that's 30% or less, but are there more areas outside of London? Can students count the total number of them on the map? Prompt number 6 is getting us to start thinking about that suggestion or analysis. So this could come from some of the information that's been provided in the yellow box with this figure as well. So why do students think there is such a difference in the recycling rates across the UK? So that's getting them to sort of start looking at that quite complex one. The final figure I'm going to talk to you about is on page 3, the rate of recycling in the UK. So this is the line graph at the top. So again, doing very similar things with what do we notice about the data. So getting students to describe the overall trend, having a look at specific points on the graph. So what's the recycling rate at the start and end of the graph, for example, in 2000 compared to 2019. Then I've got question for prompt 4, you can see here is getting them to break down different sections of the graph. So whilst the graph is showing us an overall trend, the rate of it isn't happening the same at different points. So this is getting students to recognize that at parts of the graph, there's a really steep increase in the rates of recycling. And at other points, it's beginning to slow down and then almost plateau. It's not beginning to change at all. 5, again, getting students to think about where's the largest rate of increase happening. So they've got to look at the graph, calculate the differences between different years. And then after 2010, the final prompt there, number 6, getting students to think about this big change that we're seeing in the recycling rates that, again, is sort of alluding to the figure before where it says that recycling rates are slowing down. So it's allowing students begin to make sort of connections with this. So these are kind of just examples of tables or sort of little activities that I might get students to do to begin to break down these figures so that they've got a good understanding of these maps and the graphs, so that if you get those short answer data questions, you know, they've got a better understanding of the figure and the knowledge that they need to come with it. So that's me done, Abdi, my little bit, having a look at 6 things you notice on the graphs and the map.
Great, thank you so much, Glynnis. So useful. It might not be like the best format, but I've literally myself sat here making notes, and I'm the one who's seen these slides already. I think it's really helpful, you know, to have these things. And don't worry, so long as the presenters are happy after, I'll be sharing the slides when I'm able to share the YouTube link. But I think this is so important. You might look at a figure like the one of the recycling rate, that sort of line graph, and think, oh, this is so easy to break down. But you know, the exam board know full well that it is quite easy to look at for everyone. So there's an option there to ask more sort of complex questions. So it's good that they sort of break it down to the nth degree, and that's really helpful. Thank you.
Like you say, some people might think it's quite obvious, but students don't always get it. So it's just a way of getting them to have a look at it. So yeah, more than happy for the slides to be shared and for people to sort of use the ideas. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Glynnis. Right, up next we have Katie. Okay, there you go, Katie. I'll just show them all, shall I? Shall I just go?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Abdi. Okay, so I'm not going to talk to you guys for very long, but I just kind of wanted to give my sixpence about what I have found has worked for our students. Now, I work at an academy. We are a small, quite rural academy where we have a lot of students that are low prior attainers. We have a handful of students that are high prior attainers, aiming for those sort of 7, 8s and 9s, but the majority of our students are aiming at 3, 4s and 5s. And actually their reading rates are quite low. reading ages, sorry, are quite low. So for them, the pre-release is quite an intimidating thing. To us, we look at it and think, yeah, that makes perfect sense. I can read this, I understand it, I can see patterns, I can pick out the information from it. But actually, as actually everyone else has touched on already, it can be quite intimidating, and something that we have to remember, that the students aren't necessarily going to pick up on the same patterns that we will unless we explicitly tell them. So I personally have found that the 3 figures, so your pages 2 and 3, 4 and 5, and then 6 and 7, actually kind of reflect the question types, and they reflect the structure of the exam. So we all know that AQA exams have a relatively familiar structure each time. You start off with those low stakes questions. They might be a multiple choice question, or just a sort of a 1 or 2 mark, maybe a 3 mark question maximum, to introduce each section of the paper, and paper 3 reflects that structure. And you'll tend to find that most of those low stakes questions are related to figure 1, to those first couple of pages in the booklet. That's not to say that they always will be. Obviously, I haven't written the exams, I don't write the papers, so I can't 100% say, tell your students that they will always be from that first figure. But 90% of the time, I've noticed that that is what happens. So it's often easier for those low stakes questions if students know to expect them coming from the first couple of pages within the pre-release booklet. That can sometimes help them. Also, another thing to point out to the students, and exactly like Amanda said earlier about that synopticity, is that each figure builds on the last one. So figure 1 is more of a general statement about the idea of waste, and by the time you get through to figure 3, it's looking at that really specific issue. Point that out to the students, because some of them won't have put that link together. They will see them as 3 standalone figures and won't have realised that actually it's a journey that they're going through, and they're building on that knowledge, and they need to create those links. And when they start to realise that, again, going back to what Amanda said, they'll start to put that synopticity into their answers. They'll start to realise that actually, if I'm answering the 9 mark question, I don't only need to use the information on figure 3, I can pick information out from figure 1 and figure 2 as well, because I know that is relevant and that supports that information. And again, I might be teaching lots of you to suck eggs. I'm not saying that, you know, I'm some god that understands everything about the pre-release, but from my experience, that has been a really big thing to point out to the students. The 9 mark question will generally always be based on figure 3, but again, repeating what I've just said, it doesn't mean that they can only use figure 3 to answer that question. Figure 3 will help them a lot, but as we know, there's also part of figure 2 that gives sort of Ami's side of the argument, like Abdi said earlier, and that's really going to help them if they're showing both sides of their argument in figure 3, especially if it's the side of the argument that they personally don't agree with. You can kind of predict the questions to an extent. I've obviously put that bit in there because if we could predict what the questions were, then the students would all get 100%, and that would be obviously completely pointless. But another big thing that I always point out to the students, and I point out to any staff that are in my department, especially we've got a couple of ECTs and sort of second year ECTs that maybe have never seen a pre-release document before. Looking at the title of each figure, looking at specific headings will give you an example and give you an idea of what the questions might be about. Now, I've actually done the cardinal sin, and even though Abdi emailed us about 5 times saying not to forget, I have forgotten my pre-release and don't have it in front of me. So I cannot actually name you any specific headings right now, but you can obviously have a look through the booklets that hopefully you'll have in front of you and see that lots of the headings will give you clues about what questions could be about. And something I've also noticed, which is another good thing about AQA, is they will use the wording from the headings in the question. So your students can put those links together, especially if you've got those low prior attainers like myself that actually maybe need that signposting of this question is talking specifically about a waste incinerator. Oh, look, there's a section that says waste incinerator. Obviously, like I said, I don't have my pre-release in front of me, so terrible example, but you get the idea. They'll use the similar language, and that allows you to show your students and actually help them figure out where to look for the answers. Again, that kind of goes against what Amanda said, which was, you know, don't just lift things directly from the pre-release, but for some students, that is all they are going to be able to do in that situation. They might panic, they might not remember sort of their own knowledge, if that makes sense. They're just going to lift things. And although lifting isn't going to get them those top level marks, it might get them marks that they wouldn't have got if they didn't know that that information was there to help them. My biggest recommendation, just to finish off, is don't assume that you can just go through the pre-release ad hoc. Actually spend some time planning some lessons for yourself if you're a single department, or if you are in a large department, work with your team, because there'll be people in your team that have noticed things you might not have noticed. And already just listening to the other presenters speak tonight, I'm going, oh, I hadn't thought of that. So it's really good to work collaboratively on this if you can, and get them to consider the kind of questions that they think could come up. What questions could you ask about the information? What ideas can you actually glean from the information in front of us? But at the same time, don't use that as gospel for your students. Don't fall into the trap of going, I think the 9 marker is going to be this, just practice this question over and over and over again. Because then your students will trust you implicitly, because they do. They'll go, right, I've rehearsed that question, I can write it word for word, and then a different 9 mark or 6 mark question comes up, and they bottom out because they aren't expecting it. So practice several different types of questions, but keep saying to your students as much as possible, I don't know the questions, I don't know the exam paper, any question could come up. These are just for practice. These are just to get your head around the information. You may have to adapt it differently in the exam. And I think that's really important. And I think that's somewhere where I've seen colleagues fall down in the past, is that they've almost been too rigid and said, this is what I think is going to come up and that's what you should learn. So it really needs to be that fine balance between predicting, but also instructing them and teaching them how to find the information out themselves and how to adapt that information to fit the question, rather than just being able to repeat a question that they've wrote, if that makes sense. And that is me done. Hope that made sense and I didn't ramble too much.
Yeah, no, really good. Thank you, Katie. I think it's so important that especially just as you finished up, I think it reminds me of what one of my year 11 said to me on Monday. And she said, we're going to practice the 9 marker in time conditions. And I said, what do you mean the 9 marker? She said, oh, well, the one you think is going to come up. And I said, yeah, I think it's going to come up. I'm just not 100% sure. And I said, so we can practice elements, but we're going to practice that one and other ones. And we're going to treat them all the same until that day when you open up the exam and before me what the real question is. I think, all the other sort of small maths questions that, Glynnis brought up earlier, I think, one of my students again said, oh, these ones you've made up, and are they going to come up? And I said, no. First of all, no, I haven't made them up. I've probably stolen them from another teacher. And number 2, they're not probably going to come up, or they might do, but at least you've engaged with the content, and that's it. You've got your brain sort of warm, so to speak, and that's better than someone who doesn't. Because we know, I mean, there might be some people in here right now, unfortunately, who because of mocks or finishing content or whatever may only have a couple of lessons or homework to do it, and we know that's the case. I've been in that position myself. I've had to set 95% of the pre-release before in the past as homework, and so I guess when you're lucky to have the time, you've got to use it as much as possible. And like Katie was saying, definitely plan and don't just, sort of sit there and read through the pre-release, because it won't sort of engagement with it won't come up magically. But thanks for that. So last but not least, we've got Alecia.
Thanks, Abdi. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about how we can encourage students to evaluate. So as we know, the issue evaluation section of paper 3, it does culminate into a decision. And I think I've learned from this TeachMeet that actually we can't assume that it's going to be should the incinerator be built. So I think that's something for me to take away. So in terms of why we should be thinking about why we need to encourage students to develop those evaluation skills, paper 3 has a very strong weighting in AO3. So looking at applying knowledge and understanding to interpret, analyze, evaluate geographical information and issues to make judgments. This is a really important skill that they're going to need for this paper. And AO3 is about 35% of it. The first thing that I'm going to be talking about is actually echoes the sentiments of Amanda about helping students to understand the context of the area. So it's difficult for the students to have an opinion and therefore evaluate if they don't care. So obviously AQA have made it really clear that students don't need to read information outside of the booklet in preparation, but adding context and interest around the issues of waste management, recycling, energy in the region of Cambridgeshire, I think will really go a long way, particularly because it's not necessarily the most exciting topic that the pre-release has been based on. I think a really good start with students is, what do they already know about the area and about waste management? You know, students probably hear a lot about, you know, recycling and think that everyone recycles and there's not an issue. And, you know, dispelling misconceptions about the area. So, you know, it is actually one of the most unequal cities in the UK, Cambridge, and it is not in London, as some students who might be outside of the region may assume. You know, providing context about the social, economic, environmental understanding of the area. You know, map work, you know, using the OS maps, you know, getting Google Maps out, you know, where is Cambridge and what is it near? And also just what's interesting about Cambridge, what's interesting about waste management, because when facts at stick, students are more likely to feel invested in the area, to have an opinion, and therefore more able to make a judgment. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so one of the pitfalls for students when it comes to evaluating is either, as we've heard, you know, previously tonight, students will just lift information from the paper and dump it in the answer, or they might go down an Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole and you know, be completely irrelevant to the question, or just, you know, go off topic, or, you know, go outside the marking that is available to them. So this is one of the reasons why having some type of structure to support students when they go into the exam and thinking about the language is really important. So when we think about the word evaluation, it's about making a judgment about the importance of something, you know, considering both sides and using that evidence and then coming to a conclusion. And I've got in the pink box as well some of the command words that are commonly used, evaluative ones with AQA. Another reminder there in the blue box, can your students identify and use comparative connectives? So words like on the other hand, to some extent, I believe that, in contrast, because actually using those words demonstrate their ability to evaluate and actually encourage them to do that as they're writing. And I'm sure a lot of schools teach structuring in terms of longer mark questions. In my school or academy, we do evidence, comment, stretch. Some of you might have, you know, point, evidence, comment, you know, and it might be similar in subjects such as history and English. But teaching students and being very clear about a structure of how to answer a question that's evaluating will go a really long way in helping them to gain more marks in that question. So for example, we've got a point evidence development structure here, trying to be sort of generic. So on one hand, they, you know, give their opinion, and then there'd be evidence, for example, and that would be where they're lifting from the text. And then the development, this is where they're getting that those additional marks, particularly for those weaker students that would just collect and dump on the page from the booklet. This means, or this leads to, or this supports my argument because. So just something for us to bear in mind in terms of how language and structure can support our students in evaluating. Next slide, please. Okay. So in terms of activities to help students develop their evaluation skills, there's lots of different things that you can do. And I'm sure some of them you've done before anyway, so this might be, you know, a good reminder. We've got the classic Diamond 9, or I've put in brackets here 3 or 6, depending on the ability of the students and the time that you've got. And I think some really a really good top tip would be to actually either get the students to write them on cards or pre-write them, or print them out and cut them out, because I think there's something about physically arranging them which gets students to discuss, to debate, and therefore they're developing those evaluation skills. I quite like the washing line, so it's quite similar to the diamond line, but where they have the strongest arguments to the weakest arguments. And, you know, you can go all in with this, maybe giving them some string, you know, they can, you know, tie the string across their chairs and then have clothes pegs where they're hanging, you know, the different ideas and the strongest to weakest. And what you could do to develop this activity further is have students move around in groups, looking at other groups' washing line, and then making a judgment on them and saying, well, actually, I think that would be a stronger argument. They should have really put that point over here. Or I think that is more of a sustainable approach than this one. And again, that really helps develop their evaluation. There's the on the other hand, and they can either have like a pre-printed hand, or, I don't know, students love this, actually drawing around their own hand. Who knew that would be such an engaging activity for young people? But you know, they would have an argument either for or against, and again, you know, we're moving away from the idea that it's just going to be whether this, you know, this should be set up. It could be, you know, around a lot of, you know, wider issues related to the subject, and then getting students to put their points on either hand, you know, for and against, and then having a conclusion at the end, so having a box that says a conclusion. In terms of scaffolding, you could have sentence starters on the hands to help weaker students, and maybe a keyword box. So the challenge for students would be they have to use all the keywords that you've provided to help them build up the sentence. And the final one is what snowballs or paper planes. It's the same thing. I would have said we're kind of out the snowball season. I'm based in the northeast, and it snowed 3 times today. My car was covered this morning. We had hailstones later today, and then it snowed on the way home. So perhaps it might be more relevant than I think. Some of you may have heard this before, but you start off writing the first part of an answer. Every student has their own piece of paper, so it would be a point. So I agree that, or I think that. Then you screw up your paper or your paper plane, and then everyone is on one side of the room and they throw it across the other side of the room. And then everyone goes over and picks up another piece of paper and then develops that person's point of paper that they've picked up. And then they keep doing that until they've got a developed point. Now you can differentiate this by having, depending on a student's ability, low, mid, high ability students will have different coloured paper. So it means that you'll have to pick up the paper colour depending on what your target grade is, or what your predicted grade might be, to support with students with that in that task. And then there's one more activity. So just on the next slide. This is 4 times better. Now, this is an activity that we do use in my academy, and I find it really useful in terms of developing exam answers. So every student has a piece of paper on their tables or in their groups, and they divide it into 4 sections, and you'll have the development of an argument. So the structure. So on one hand, I agree. Then you've got your example, which is your evidence, and then why that supports your argument. So that stretch of your point that you're trying to make. And then what students do is every student on their own piece of paper, they complete the on one hand I agree, and they might be given 1 to 2 minutes to do that depending on the ability of the students. And then they move their piece of paper around on their table or in their group. They get a piece of paper from another student and write in box 2. So they have to read what someone else has put as the argument and then find the evidence that supports that argument. They fill that in for a minute or 2, then pass the sheet around again. So they've now got a third piece of paper where one person's had a point, another person's lifted evidence, and then they need to say why that supports the argument. So they're constantly thinking on different perspectives around that argument or the question, and I think it's a really great task because students get really into it, and you can always add in incentives of prizes for the best group answer and so on, and you can always pre-add sentence starters to support those weaker students. So I think that's my last slide. Hopefully you found that useful to help with the students in the next coming weeks. Thanks very much.
Really good. Thank you, Alecia. That was really good. I was just considering actually how I might use this in my forthcoming lessons. Well, I really like this idea because obviously it encourages students to not only have their own point, but then be ready to basically counter someone else's point, which is really good. And I really like the washing line idea as well. I hadn't realized how powerful, if we just go back to it actually, and realize how powerful it could be to have some other student look at another student's basically line of thinking or opinion and actually question it and say, actually, I agree with you, but have you picked the best evidence, or I disagree with you and here's why. So no, that was really good. Thank you. I guess that brings this to an end. Just want to say a quick thank you to all the presenters for today. If this was if I could allow your mics, I would, but I know just one clap would send my internet connection all the way down to hell. So I'm probably not going to do that, but I know you'll be eternally thankful for their suggestions and for their ideas today. Amanda's had to leave us. Amanda moonlights as a CrossFit instructor as well, so she's gone to do that, believe it or not. So she's a paper 3 examiner by day and a CrossFit examiner by night. So she's gone to do that. So I guess at this point it just leaves me to say thank you to everyone who's here. The TeachMeet is now over. If you'd like to leave, of course, you're more than welcome to. I'll just have a bit of a request. If you could potentially fill this Google form in for me, either by scanning the screen now with your phone, and you'll be able to use the QR code, or just with the link that I've just put in the chat now. That would be great. But feel free to stay behind and ask any questions. I am now going to trawl upwards in the chat to see if I can find the questions that were asked before. I think I do remember one, and it was, I think, meant for Amanda, but we'll do our best to answer it. But like I said, if you've got any questions, feel free to drop them here, and our presenters and I will do our best to answer them. There was one earlier, I think I remember it almost word for word, about the structure of the 9 marker. So perhaps I'll sort of pose it to all of you. Someone said, would you recommend the structure of either paragraph 1, 4, so for the argument, paragraph 2, 4, paragraph 3 against, and then conclusion, or paragraph 1 uses figure 1, paragraph 2 uses figure 2, paragraph 3 uses figure 3. If you want to scroll up, it was done by C. Evans at about 7:05. I said I'd get to it later. I mean, I guess I can start. I would suggest the first structure, the paragraph 1, 4, paragraph 2, 4, and then paragraph 3 against. Mainly because that's how I would advise 9 markers to be done in a normal, well, quote unquote normal paper 1, paper 2 exam. So then I don't want them to change their mind. I think, to be honest, the other one might be a bit too clunky. And depending on the wording of the question, they might not have enough from figure 1. So, you know, if figure 1 deserves to be 1 or 2 lines somewhere in the 9 marker, then so be it. And most focuses on 2 or 3 or whatever. But I don't know if any of you guys want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Abdi. I think I would definitely go for the first structure with sort of your 4, 4 against, or however you're doing it, just because I think, like you said, we don't know what that questions bit could be. And actually, if you've trained your students to make sure that paragraph is all about figure 1, and actually there's very little information you can take from figure 1 to answer the question for whatever reason, then that could in itself throw the students off thinking, well, sir or miss told me I have to do paragraph 1 about figure 1, but I don't know what to write about figure 1. And actually you don't want them to go into a spiral. I know that's something some of my students might do because they take everything that you've said as gospel. And also sometimes actually, again, like Amanda said, the figures are synoptic. You don't want to necessarily use them as those standalone things. You want to interweave them and use bits from figure 1 with bits from figure 3. So actually, by doing it in that first structure, students should be able to get that higher level, that higher understanding, because they can weave all of the information together.
Yeah. I'd agree with that as well. Just the 4 kind of the arguments for and against. The only possible thing to maybe add in, possibly tying with what Amanda said, is about length of answer. And if you're going for 3 paragraphs plus a conclusion, it could potentially be too much for trying to fit in the line spacing, and then sort of, as Amanda hinted at, students going over into extra paper. If you don't mind, Abdi, I'm going to do a slight plug for something I've done previously on
go for it.
The TeachMeet. The structure that I've talked about before at Jog Icons, and a few people have heard me talk about it on Twitter, is we use a structure called yes, but. So within a paragraph, you get the student to include the point of, yes, this is why this should happen, but then the counter argument to go with it. And you do that within a paragraph, and you do it twice with a final conclusion at the end. And we found that as cut down massively on the amount of writing that our students are doing, in the sense of we don't get whole huge paragraphs of 4, 4 and against, because they've got to do it succinctly within a paragraph. So the initial structure that was mentioned in the chat, yes, that's definitely the way I do it. My only precaution might be 2 paragraphs 4 and 1 against could end up with the student having a very long answer that might be just reducing their time elsewhere. So it might be sort of saying to students, definitely having 1, 4 and against, see how they're going with timing, as if they want to bring in anything else.
Yeah. Anything to add, Alecia? I think you might still be muted if you're trying to speak. I don't know if you are.
Oh, sorry, I haven't
Oh,
unmuted. There we go. Classic there. I would sort of add to what Amanda had mentioned about the timings, and be really strict with it. And I found that actually I can be quite lenient with timings. That we do put a timer on. Sometimes I might say if students want an extra minute, they can do, but actually they need to understand what it's like to work under pressure. And actually sometimes giving the time 10 minutes before the bell goes is actually a really good way of getting them to write very quickly and write under pressure, because they know, right, we've got a next lesson after this, so you're going to have to leave and finish there and then. And then they get into that habit, and then within that time they'll get the idea of how much they can do. So whether they can do 3 paragraphs, or for a lot of our students what would be realistic is 2 paragraphs and then a conclusion after that.
Yeah, no, great. I agree with that. I'm just trying to make my way from the top to the bottom in terms of questions. Duncan, I believe, is from Arc Putney Academy. I've heard good things about that place. Used to have a great head of geography, I believe. says, would it be worthwhile asking students to do the unfamiliar? I believe let me see if I'm reading this correctly. Would it be good to ask students to do the unfamiliar fieldwork section first and then go back and do section A to sort of, I guess, stop them from going over the time on the 9 marker? I guess that's the sort of question being asked here. So basically do the unfamiliar fieldwork stuff first, then go back and do the pre-release, because that will mean they're restricted. My opinion of that is no. I always say to students, look, if that works for you and you want to do it when the doors closed in the exam hall, or even in the lead up in mocks when you can try things out, then yeah, go for it. But I don't know if it works for a student, then yes, they can go for it, but they'll be the judge of that. I won't, from my position as their teacher, advise it. Not for any particular reason, to be honest with you, because maybe it will work for some and then not for the others. And the one who thinks it just by definition is going to work because Sir said it's going to work, might not, because they might still do unfamiliar fieldwork first, then come back to the first section and skip questions in order to still spend 15-20 minutes time on the 9 marker. So they've actually done that method to stop what they thought they were going to do and then still done it anyway. So yeah, kids will do funny things. Anything on that?
I kind of agree with that. Sort of, you can say to the students, do things in a particular order, but at the end of the day, I think it's down to them and what they feel comfortable with when they get in there. You might have told them to do a certain thing. They get in there, open the first page, look at it and think, I can't do that. And then actually that whole game plan goes out the window for them. So I think it might be something to have a conversation with students about and say, look, this is your realistic time limit. And you need to be aware of how much you're able to do under certain conditions. But I wouldn't personally say, do this order and do that. I think it is down to a student's individual choice.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's enough faffing on with paper 1 and 2 about which section students are going to do. I think we're still trying to train our students about, what questions to skip out. And, with our mock, some students did the whole paper for paper 2, even though we told them not to. So I think just working their way from start to finish in paper 3 is probably the easiest thing. But again, just as you guys were saying, whatever works for the students, if they generally feel doing it the opposite way works for them, then good on them.
Yeah, and just a final thing to add on that, I think as a Year 11 form tutor this year, I've just learned actually how many other subjects they've got and how many other exams they've got. So you're teaching them all these little sort of neat tricks and tips and things for geography, and you think, oh, you might actually have another exam that day and then definitely another exam the next day and then one, so many, I look at the gap between paper 2 and 3 and I think, oh, great, lots of revision time for paper 3. That's not really the case because they've got other GCSEs. Okay, in terms of other questions, we've still got about 100 or so people hanging out with us, so thank you for staying here. Ben asks,
sorry, I was going to say, if I dive in, Abdi, I found one near the bottom that we can do if you want.
I think I found one here. So Ben says, what do you think is the most important aspect to focus on to support low ability students? I'll keep my answer to that one short and sweet. Definitely vocabulary. If they don't understand the words in the question or in the figure, then they've got, as sort of doom and gloom as it sounds, they've got no hope. As Amanda said earlier, with the word relief. They don't know what the word relief is. I think AQA are going to move away from their nice thing of putting things in brackets, which I don't know what happened to them over the lockdown. Maybe they were feeling sorry for all of us and our students, probably rightfully so actually, that they did that. I don't think they're going to do that anymore. So yeah, vocabulary, 100% for me.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. We actually recently had some trust-wide CPD on literacy and reading ages, and did the age-old thing that we've probably all done in CPD at some point, which is where they gave you a piece of text from a book, but they've changed some of the words to be complete and utter gobbledygook, and actually you couldn't understand what this text was trying to tell you. And it was, when it was translated back to real English, it was something as simple as the dog went for a walk in a park and sniffed a tree. But because they'd changed words like dog, walk, park, tree, you just had those in-between words, the the's, the ins, the as, the whatever, that then actually make no sense. And if the students haven't got that understanding of that key knowledge and actually that key vocabulary and what it's telling you, they are not going to be able to answer the questions, let alone find the information in the pre-release to even lift it and put it in a question box in the first place. And I saw someone had commented and put, one of the things they said was their students didn't know what the word plant was in relation to like a power plant. We forget that we know what that word means, something as simple as that. But actually, we've got to remember that that's a homophone, and to lots of students, it means a green thing that grows out of the ground. So it's not just the sort of long words with lots of syllables. We also have to pick on those low stakes tier 1 and tier 2 vocabulary as well, and check that they really understand that, because then even if they are just lifting information straight from the pre-release, at least they actually have the opportunity to do that because they understand what the information is telling you.
Yeah, no, completely agree. Anything from you guys on that about what your top tips would be for low ability students?
Similar thing with vocabulary. It would almost be getting students to go through and work their way through perhaps a keyword glossary, or for each figure highlighting key terms, having that conversation about what does this word mean in that context. I saw that comment as well about plant, and like you said, Katie, it's one that you might not even consider, incinerator plant. Oh, that's fine, we know what that means. So I think it would be vocabulary, but in context of the text that it's in the paper.
Yeah. Okay, final couple of questions. I realize we're now reaching the hour mark, so I don't want to keep anyone here too long. Sarah asks, should I advise my students to put lifted evidence in quotation marks so that they know that they should develop this so that they don't get capped for lifting? I actually just want to answer that one and then put that straight to you guys, because I myself don't really know. A lot of my students have asked me this and said, oh, we're looking at this for this many weeks. How do you expect us to not lift it? And I actually told them that. I said, look, you wouldn't do this to a paper 1 or paper 2 figure because you've seen it. You only saw it 45 seconds ago, so you don't have this familiarity with it. But I think students, because they get this familiarity, think, oh, well, pre-release words, my words, what's the difference, right? We're both saying the same thing because they get sort of into it, even though it is something like waste incineration, Cambridge, they're still going to get into it. So I would say, yes, putting some stuff in quotation marks, especially if you're referring to maybe the opinions of people, or just saying the normal stuff like in figure 1, in figure 2, in figure 3, but I don't really know. Any thoughts?
Sorry, Alecia, you go first.
Yeah, I think quotation marks is actually quite a good idea, because when students are looking at their work, if they're just lifting, they'll just see quotation marks. So that will, I think, encourage them to be like, and therefore this supports the argument, or therefore, developing that point. So yeah, I think that's a good idea.
I would also get them to sort of caution the length of the things they might be quoting and sort of lifting. I think a little bit about students with kind of English exams, and they have quotes and things that you have to use from text. I would really worry if the student is kind of almost taking out whole sentences to sort of use it in that lifting. I think if they're going to lift anything, it might need to be perhaps 1 or 2 words, or something very, very short, and in which case quotation marks would work. I just would worry that they would then start perhaps wanting to copy out like an entire thing to fill up answer space.
Yeah,
I think you both just took the words right out of my mouth. That idea of hopefully the quotation marks would encourage them to see, oh, all I've done is quotation marks, therefore I need to actually put some of my own knowledge into that and my own understanding. But then again, exactly what you just said, Glynnis, about like in English, they're encouraged to put quotations in, but they're going to be short, sharp ones to make the point. And I suppose the argument we can put forward to the students is you've actually had time to be familiar with this, so you should be able to put that information into your own words. So pick out that short phrase, maybe 2 or 3 words, whatever it might be, if that's powerful and impactful and relevant. But actually, don't just copy out a whole sentence because it's easier. Paraphrase it, put it into your own words, show that you've got that understanding actually of what that sentence is, rather than just, I can copy it off a page.
Great. I've just seen the 5-minute warning. I don't know whether in Microsoft Teams it does the exact same thing as School Cloud or Zoom and just shuts off. I'm very wary of that. So
it doesn't.
It doesn't?
No, having done my entire lockdown using Teams lessons, it doesn't. It tells you a warning,
right.
But it
right.
won't.
Fine, so we'll ignore the warning. Fine, okay. Miss Hayes asks, in the 6-mark do you agree question, do students have to give a balance both sides of the argument, or could they give one definitive one-sided decision? So this is the do you agree command word. As far as I'm aware, having, I think, read one examiner's report recently, and the mark schemes for it, I think no. I think you are allowed to, in the do you agree question, I think you are allowed to say yes, this is why yes, and no, and this is why no. That's why it's one of those sort of weird questions that after hammering them for 2 years with balance this, balance that, that they sort of do. I think it would still be good practice to balance it. I think very little in geography is, I mean, probably nothing really, is that black and white that you can say yes or no to it. But I think technically, according to the specs, I think if we use a paper 1 example, like coastal management strategies have been effective in protecting the coastline, do you agree? You could go yes and not mention a single cost of coastal management. It wouldn't be great, obviously, because you know them, but I think you'd get away with it. Well, you definitely would get away with it and get 6 out of 6. Is that right?
Yeah, I definitely second that. I've read something from an examiner on Facebook that had commented on an exact question like that on the Facebook group that was, what do you do with 6 markers? And I remember screenshotting it on my phone going, I'm going to use that piece of information. And the person that had commented had definitely said for 6 markers, it does not have to be a balanced viewpoint. And actually, if you go back through and look at many of the mark schemes for 6 questions, often in the points underneath towards the end, it may say something like, student could consider both viewpoints but doesn't have to, or answer does not need to be balanced. So for a 6 marks question, exactly as you've just said, Abdi, it can be a if you're assessing something or do you agree, it can solely back up the one viewpoint. It's the 9 markers they really want to see the 2 sides and the balanced viewpoint. So that's then obviously where you can encourage students to make sure that they have got those both sides of the argument.
Yeah.
And I suppose it kind of comes down to that wording of the question again, doesn't it? Because do you agree is a very closed question. It's kind of a yes or no answer, isn't it? Whereas to what extent do you agree, or assess the extent to which you agree with a statement, that they're opening it up more to partly agree, mostly agree, that those kind of things, aren't they? So yeah, it's also that wording of the questions and teaching the students the command words and how to recognise actually that they are, although they sound similar, they are actually asking different things.
Yeah. Right, I think last couple ones. Okay, how beneficial is it? So Tom asks, how beneficial is it to bring your own understanding into your answers in paper 3, especially for our more able pupils to gain those top marks? As far as I'm aware, if you were to look through a mark scheme for paper 3, the pre-release section, do Control F and try and look for AO1, there wouldn't be any of it. I'm pretty sure. Am I correct in saying that? There's no AO1 whatsoever. Is it purely 100% AO3 and 2 or just AO3?
I think there's some AO4 as well, isn't there? From
Fine.
skills,
yeah,
as well. But yeah, no AO1.
Yeah.
And Amanda said that earlier, didn't she? That actually AQA, the guidance actually encourages you to not have to do that reading around and actually purely just to use the pre-release.
Yeah. So hopefully that one answers it. Tom, I guess it's nice. So, for example, just to go back earlier to when I mentioned those quotes from that really long report commissioned by the Secretary of State, I read that. I turned it into like a little resource for my students, mainly. And one of them asked me like, "Oh, do we have to quote?" I don't know. One of their names was like Sue something. I said, "Do we have to quote this person?" I said, "No, you don't have to remember Sue's name or whatever. It's just more the gist and what her take on the argument was and the debate, etc. So we can engage with it. But no, there's no. I don't think." Yeah, I think students might think that something like that will impress an examiner, but if they said no, then examiners will be very strictly trained on not allowing it to impress them. And examiners are obviously quite good at doing that and not following sort of their indicative content.
I would just also jump in on that, Abdi, as well. If we've got students and teachers that a little bit like myself have quite limited time left on our content, and if you're having to set things for homework, or like you've said, you're a year 11 tutor, they've got hundreds of other subjects and bits to go with it. I think it's more beneficial for students to not get involved down a rabbit hole of Googling lots of things and going down lots of news reports, when actually that could be really detracting them away from valuable time being able to spend on the pre-release. I do like Amanda's comment of the setting the scene. I think that's appropriate so that students know where Cambridge is and they know the context of what they're dealing with. But I think anything else that allows them to, go down a real rabbit hole of looking everything up isn't going to be useful for their time.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think, I just good. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up again. The ones who currently don't have enough time to even do that and actually are considering doing that for homework or whatever it might be, don't, just to focus on the actual pre-release text itself as homework. Then the final question we've got, which I think, thank you, Alecia, for jumping in on, was, I guess, just a nice sum up question from Rob. Second year ECT, having not taught paper 3 before and no experience, there's no experienced geographer in my department. What are your top tips? I guess to give you guys a bit of thinking time so we can wrap it up. I think I'll go first in terms of top tips for this section. First one is the one about being flexible with what you think is going to come up as the 9-mark question. That's one of my sort of top tips in terms of, I think it's when you look back to a couple of years, you think you know what the question is going to be, but we don't know. And make sure your students do know that as well. Nobody knows. Prepare for it, of course, but don't assume. The other one would, I guess, be about language, not only language of the pre-release, so words like waste, incinerator, plant, sustainability, but also command words too, and what command words mean. And like we just had the discussion, you know, if do you agree comes up, no, they don't need to balance, what do you do to what extent, etc., etc. And the final one, yeah, I guess probably about timing. So they're going to feel the sense that for the first time across 3 papers, they know, or they think they know what's going to come up. So they won't feel like this for the paper 1 9 markers. They won't feel like this for the paper 2 9 markers. They'll feel, oh, you know, they'll turn the paper over and go, oh, this is either 100% what my teacher predicted or very close. So I'm now going to really go to town, write 2 pages on it. They'll either sacrifice questions they've missed earlier, they missed on purpose to get to that, or questions later in unfamiliar fieldwork. And they just can't do that because one amazing 9 marker that gets 9 out of 9 is not going to make up for lots of 1, 2, 3, even 4 markers left blank. So I think that's probably it for me. You guys don't have to give 3, don't worry. I think I've just probably taken 3 quite good ones, so sorry. But you can go in any particular order, even 1 top tip's fine.
I would say, especially as a new teacher, have a look at previous pre-releases, not necessarily for the content, but for the structure. So what the pre-release was and what the paper was, just so that you feel comfortable about what the students are going to embark on, because obviously they are different, but there is a similar structure there. And I would also emphasize to students, I guess, the duality of the paper, that one, there's a lot of accessible marks. So this is the paper that can really determine whether they get that target grade or that pass mark, because that pre-release is really supportive of students in that. But equally, not to see it as the paper that they don't need to revise for. So they do need to be familiar about what the knowledge is in the paper, and they do need to be practicing questions. So whether that's you're providing them with questions that they do, you know, every week, but it's just getting that balance of that message together. Yes, this is a paper that can really make a difference to your grade, but don't see it as necessarily the easy paper, because actually that could, you know, not go into their favour.
I think the big one for me is actually advice for the teacher, which is don't be scared to ask other people for help and admit, I've never done this before, it's new, it's not how it was when I was at school, what do I do? And I know that Alecia said about the geography Facebook group, EduTwitter, I am all over that like a rash. There are so many people that are willing to help you. And actually, social media, when used positively, it's like having a department around you. And if you haven't got someone in school or someone within a trust that you can call on really easily, take advantage of those groups, take advantage of meetings like this, because actually they are invaluable and everyone's really supportive. And as Abdi said right at the start, we're all in the same boat because it's completely new information to us as well, because it's a brand new pre-release each year.
Yeah, I'd echo that as well. And I noticed in Alecia's comments, she mentioned about internet geography, which is a fantastic subscription worth having. I know that Anthony's produced, I think he's now on his 4th booklet for unseen field work, which are absolutely incredible. And you can obviously take bits and pieces from them to use. My sort of approach with the unseen fieldwork this year has been to go back through all the sample papers and to use that to structure kind of, this is what it will look like. Because it's all there, you know, you just got to spend a bit of time going through it. But definitely echo the comment about using resources that are out there, and internet geography in particular has been an invaluable subscription.
Great. Well, thank you so much. On that note, I think with our top text, we'll probably leave it there. That leaves me just to say thank you so much again for all of you here. I think our peak was 141, which is really good. Not the 800 I was hoping for, but I guess maybe Virgin Media are thankful it's not that. But thank you mostly really to the presenters. I think everyone's given something slightly different, but equally as useful. Whenever I get this out onto YouTube, I will put the slides along with it. Do please complete that Google form. I know it's slightly up there. You may have done it already, but that'll be really useful for all of us. But that's it from us. Good night, everybody. I'll stop the recording now.